The cameras were already rolling when the comment dropped. Casual, almost offhand, the kind of line that sounds like it's meant to land as a punchy talking point rather than a policy declaration. "We don't need Canada's lumber." It echoed quickly, picked up by headlines, debated in studios, clipped into social media loops. Supporters nodded, critics raised eyebrows, and somewhere in between, people in hard hats and steel-toed boots, loggers, builders, truckers, paused and wondered what that actually meant for them. At first, it seemed like just another moment in a long list of bold economic statements. The idea behind it wasn't new: push for domestic production, reduce reliance on imports, strengthen national industries. On paper, it had a certain appeal. Why depend on another country's timber when vast forests stretch across American land? Why not cut, process, and build entirely from within? But markets don't move on slogans. They move on supply chains, contracts, labor, infrastructure, things that don't shift overnight just because someone said they should. Within days, the ripple effects began. Lumber prices, which had already been volatile in recent years, started reacting. Traders weren't sure what to expect. Was this rhetoric, or was policy about to follow? If tariffs tightened or import restrictions increased, the immediate question wasn't whether the U.S. could produce enough lumber, it was whether it could do it fast enough and cheap enough. Because that's the part that rarely makes headlines. Canada isn't just a convenient supplier, it's a deeply integrated part of the North American lumber system. For decades, mills across the border have been producing softwood at scale, shipping it efficiently into U.S. markets. Builders rely on it not out of habit, but because it's predictable, priced competitively, and available in the volumes needed to keep construction timelines intact. And construction, unlike political messaging, runs on tight margins and even tighter schedules. So, when uncertainty crept in, builders hesitated. Some rushed to lock in contracts before prices could spike further. Others paused projects altogether, calculating whether rising material costs would erase their profits. Developers started asking uncomfortable questions. If lumber gets more expensive, do we raise home prices? If we raise home prices, who can still afford to buy? Meanwhile, in logging communities across the U.S., the reaction was more complicated than expected. On the surface, the idea of boosting domestic lumber production sounded like a win. More demand for American timber could mean more jobs, more investment, more activity. But scaling up isn't as simple as flipping a switch. Forestry operates on long timelines. Trees take years, often decades, to mature. Mills require upgrades, expansions, workforce training. Environmental regulations, land use policies, and logistical constraints all factor into how quickly production can grow. Even if demand surged overnight, supply wouldn't instantly match it. And then there's the cost. Canadian lumber has long been competitive not just because of supply, but because of efficiency. Transportation networks, established trade flows, and economies of scale keep prices relatively stable. Replacing that with purely domestic production could mean higher costs, at least in the short to medium term. Which brings us back to the moment the comment hit, because what followed wasn't a dramatic collapse or an immediate transformation. It was something subtler, but just as significant: tension. Tension in markets trying to price in uncertainty. Tension in industries caught between political messaging and operational reality. Tension in households already dealing with affordability challenges. Homebuyers began to feel it first. As lumber prices fluctuated, construction costs followed. For a new home, even a modest increase in material expenses can translate into thousands of dollars added to the final price. Builders don't just absorb those costs, they pass them along. And in a housing market where affordability is already stretched, even small increases can push buyers out. So while the statement was framed as a move toward independence, the immediate question for many became, independence at what cost? At the same time, trade relationships quietly entered the spotlight. The US and Canada have one of the largest trading partnerships in the world, and lumber is just one piece of that puzzle. Moves that disrupt one sector can echo into others. If tensions rise over timber, what happens to other goods, agriculture, energy, manufacturing components? Trade isn't a series of isolated transactions, it's a network. Pull one thread and others start to shift. Back in Canada, the reaction was measured but watchful. Lumber producers had seen disputes before: tariffs, negotiations, long-standing disagreements over pricing structures. This wasn't entirely new territory, but the tone mattered. Messaging shapes expectations, and expectations influence decisions. Some Canadian mills began preparing for potential changes, adjusting output, exploring alternative markets, considering how much reliance on U.S. demand they could realistically shift if needed. Because here's the thing: while the U.S. imports Canadian lumber, Canada also depends heavily on U.S. buyers. The relationship is mutual, even if it isn't always framed that way. And that mutual dependence is what makes abrupt shifts risky. Weeks passed, and the conversation evolved. Economists weighed in, pointing out that self-sufficiency in raw materials isn't inherently bad, but it's rarely simple. The benefits of domestic production have to be balanced against efficiency, cost, and the realities of global trade. Industry leaders spoke more candidly, builders emphasized the need for stable, affordable supply, loggers highlighted capacity constraints, retailers worried about pricing shocks. Everyone, in their own way, was saying the same thing: change is possible, but it has consequences. And then something interesting started happening. Instead of a clear, immediate policy shift, the situation became a negotiation space between ideals and implementation, between messaging and mechanics. Discussions turned toward how to strengthen domestic production without destabilizing supply chains, how to encourage growth in U.S. forestry while maintaining access to imports that keep prices manageable. In other words, the reality settled somewhere in the middle. But the moment itself, the statement, the reaction, the ripple effects left a mark. Because it revealed just how interconnected something as seemingly simple as lumber really is. It's not just wood, it's housing affordability, it's jobs on both sides of a border, it's trade agreements, transportation networks, environmental policy, and economic strategy all rolled into one. And it's a reminder that in modern economies, independence isn't just about capability, it's about balance. As the dust settled, prices stabilized somewhat, though not without lingering volatility. Builders adapted as they always do, finding ways to manage costs, adjust designs, and keep projects moving. Policymakers continued debating the best path forward, weighing domestic growth against global integration. And the phrase itself? It didn't disappear, but it changed context. What started as a bold declaration became a case study in how quickly words can move markets, in how industries respond to uncertainty, in how complex the idea of not needing something really is. Because needing isn't always about necessity. It's often about efficiency, cost, and practicality. You can build entirely from domestic resources. You can restructure supply chains. You can aim for independence. But every can comes with a how, a when, and a what happens next. And that's the part that unfolded quietly after the headlines faded. The negotiations, the adjustments, the recalculations, those are the real story. Not a single sentence, but everything that followed it. In the end, the lumber kept moving. Trucks crossed borders, mills kept running, houses continued to rise, one frame at a time. But the conversation changed, and sometimes that's where the biggest impact lies, not in what's said, but in everything it sets in motion. And even after things seemed to settle into a new rhythm, the aftershocks didn't fully disappear. They just became less visible to the average person. Behind the scenes, companies began quietly rethinking how exposed they were to sudden political shifts. Procurement managers who once relied on long-standing assumptions started adding contingency plans. Instead of asking, "Where do we get the cheapest lumber?" the question slowly evolved into, "What happens if that supply suddenly tightens?" That shift in thinking doesn't grab headlines, but it changes behavior in lasting ways. Large construction firms began diversifying suppliers, sometimes paying a slight premium just to avoid being caught off guard again. Smaller builders, who didn't have the same flexibility, felt the pressure more intensely. For them, even minor price swings could determine whether a project stayed profitable or slipped into the red. Some delayed new builds, others scaled down designs, swapping out features or adjusting square footage just to keep numbers workable. At the retail level, the effects trickled down in quieter, almost mundane ways. Contractors noticed quotes expiring faster than usual. What was valid for 30 days suddenly became 10. Hardware stores adjusted pricing more frequently, sometimes weekly instead of monthly. For everyday customers, it showed up as subtle sticker shock, a deck project costing more than expected, a renovation budget stretching further than planned, and yet, at the same time, there was a parallel narrative forming, one that didn't focus on disruption, but on opportunity. In parts of the United States, local governments and private investors started revisiting the idea of expanding domestic milling capacity. Old facilities that had been operating below peak output were evaluated for upgrades. New projects were proposed, not necessarily as a direct reaction to one statement, but as part of a broader realization that supply chain resilience had become a strategic priority. But even that came with complications. Expanding production isn't just about cutting more trees. It involves environmental considerations, workforce availability, transportation logistics, and long-term sustainability. Communities near forested areas found themselves in conversations that balanced economic growth with conservation concerns. More jobs could mean more activity and income, but it could also raise questions about land use, wildlife impact, and resource management. So while one side of the debate emphasized independence and growth, another emphasized caution and balance. Meanwhile, financial markets kept doing what they always do, trying to stay one step ahead of uncertainty. Analysts began factoring in not just current supply and demand, but the probability of future policy shifts. Reports started including phrases like geopolitical risk and trade sensitivity in contexts where they hadn't been as prominent before. Lumber, once seen as a relatively straightforward commodity, was now being discussed with the same complexity as energy or semiconductors. That alone says something about how much the landscape had shifted. And then there were the broader economic signals. Housing, already one of the most closely watched sectors, became even more sensitive to material costs. When lumber prices edged up, even slightly, it fed into larger concerns about affordability. Policymakers who were already grappling with housing shortages found themselves facing an added layer of difficulty. It's one thing to encourage more building, it's another to do it when input costs are unpredictable. In some areas, developers began experimenting with alternative materials or construction methods. Engineered wood products, steel framing, modular construction, ideas that had been on the periphery started getting more serious attention. Not because traditional lumber disappeared, but because relying too heavily on any single input suddenly felt like a risk. And that's how one statement, amplified across media and markets, ended up nudging an entire industry toward rethinking its assumptions. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. Back in the political arena, the messaging continued, but with more nuance creeping in. Discussions shifted from absolute positions to more layered approaches, supporting domestic industries while maintaining strategic trade relationships. It became less about cutting off supply and more about strengthening leverage, because in reality, complete separation is rarely the goal. Influence, flexibility, and stability tend to matter more. And on the ground, in forests and mills, the daily work never really stopped. Loggers still headed out at dawn, machinery humming through dense stretches of timber. Mill workers continued processing loads into the standardized cuts that builders depend on. Truck drivers hauled shipments across long distances, navigating routes that had been established over decades. The system, complex as it is, proved resilient, not immune to disruption, but capable of absorbing it. That resilience is easy to overlook until it's tested. And in this case, the test wasn't a sudden shutdown or a dramatic policy overhaul. It was uncertainty. The kind that makes everyone pause just long enough to reconsider what they thought was stable. Over time, some of those pauses turned into permanent adjustments. Contracts began including more flexible terms. Companies invested in better forecasting tools. Industry groups pushed for clearer communication between policymakers and businesses, hoping to reduce the gap between intention and impact. Because if there's one thing that became clear, it's that timing matters just as much as direction. You can aim to increase domestic production, but if the transition isn't aligned with capacity, you create gaps. You can push for independence, but if it comes without coordination, you introduce volatility. And volatility, more than almost anything else, is what industries struggle with most. Predictability allows planning. Planning allows investment. Investment drives growth. Remove predictability even briefly, and the whole chain feels it. So the story didn't end with a single remark, and it didn't resolve into a simple outcome. Instead, it stretched out into a series of adjustments, some visible, others subtle, all interconnected. Years from now, people might not remember the exact wording that sparked the conversation, but they'll still be operating in the environment it helped shape, one where supply chains are treated with a bit more caution, where diversification is seen as strength, and where even a basic material like lumber carries a deeper awareness of how global and domestic forces intertwine. And that's the quiet legacy of moments like this. Not a dramatic turning point, but a gradual shift in how decisions get made. Because in the end, the question was never just whether one country needs another's lumber. It was how systems built over decades adapt when that assumption is challenged, even briefly. And the answer, as it turned out, wasn't simple, immediate, or absolute. It was ongoing.